Why are you girls crying? Why are you crying?
I don't know, really. I've never been married before.
Women played a crucial role in the Beatles' personal and musical history, and the impact on them was immortalized in the songs we all love. Something, For No One, Here, There, and Everywhere, or Don't Let Me Down are just some of the songs that inspired their wives. And in today's video, we will talk about the Beatles' wives and partners. John Lennon was related to three important women during his adult life: Cynthia, his first wife; Yoko, his second wife; and May Pang. Cynthia met John at Liverpool College of Art in 1958. They were both in their second year. In her memoirs, Cynthia recalls, "I'd seen John around the college, but had never spoken to him. We moved in completely different circles. I was surprised to see him in the lettering class. He didn't seem the type for the painstaking, detailed work involved. He hadn't even brought any equipment. Lennon never brought drawing tools with him, so he constantly borrowed pens and pencils from Powell, who discovered that he was only there because other teachers had refused to instruct him. When John did show up, quote, he would go out of his way to disrupt the class. His appearance was equally unpromising."
Every time I looked at him, I thought, what's this guy got? I mean, he was a real scruff. He was a real teddy boy. He looked as though he'd punch you as soon as look at you. And he ended up in the class that I was in, which was a lettering class. He didn't want to be there. And of course, being the student that I was, I had everything perfect. I was a perfectionist. I had all the right paints, rulers, brushes, pencils, and he sat behind me and kept borrowing, and I never got them back. I don't know, I really don't understand this guy, but I quite liked him because he was so outrageous and he made everybody laugh.
Powell once overheard Lennon give a compliment to a girl with blonde hair in the college, who looked similar to the French actress Brigitte Bardot. The next Saturday, Powell turned up to college with her hair several shades blonder. After a college party to celebrate the end of term, Lennon asked Powell if she wanted to, quote, go out with him. Powell quickly replied that she was engaged to a young man in Hoy Lake, even though the engagement had ended. Lennon replied, quote, I didn't ask you to fucking marry me, did I?
There was one particular day when we were all testing each other's eyes on the blackboard where we were, and we both found out that our eyesight was identical. So that was the connection, During that period, when he used to walk in with a guitar over his shoulder, looking as though he was about to kill somebody, but this particular day, he came in and he just sat in a corner, and everybody else went for lunch, and I was still trying to gather all my pens, pencils, and things that he'd nicked, and he just sat in the corner and he played Ain't She Sweet all the way through, and I just looked at him and I thought, well, that's for me. I mean, he just blew me away because I saw a completely different side of him.
They began dating, Lennon calling her Sin. In the fall of 1958, she ended her engagement to be with him, and soon would come the first arguments and episodes of jealousy, as when he slapped her after seeing her dance with Stuart Sutcliffe, causing her head to hit a wall. After the incident, she broke up with Lennon for 3 months, but resumed their relationship after his profuse apologies.
I was shocked. Really shocked that John had been physically violent. I could put up with his outbursts, the jealousy and possessiveness, but violence was a step too far. Phil had been right. I knew I had to end our relationship. For weeks I remained determined not to take John back. I even went on a few dates with a boy who lived near me and did my best to catch up with my college work. I put John firmly out of my mind. It wasn't easy, though, because I saw him around college every day. He would look over at me in the canteen or in the lettering class, and when our eyes met, in the moment before I turned away, I knew we still cared for each other as much as ever. Friends told me John missed me, and I certainly missed him, his humour, his music, and passion. After 3 months, he phoned me and asked me to go back to him. It had taken him that long to pluck up the courage. He apologized for hitting me and said it would never happen again. I hesitated for a whole second before I said yes. John was true to his word. He was deeply ashamed of what he had done. I think he had been shocked to discover he had it in him to hit me. So, Although he was still verbally cutting and unkind, he was never again physically violent to me.
Tony Bramwell, a friend of Lennon's from his youth, later said, quote, "Cynthia was beautiful, physically and inside. Although she knew he, Lennon, was apt to find love on the road, she was totally dedicated to his success, and extremely influential. He was insecure, and Cynthia was there to encourage him, to reinforce, in a way, his weak side." When Lennon went to Hamburg again in April 1962, Powell found a bedsit in a terraced house at 93 Garmoyle Road, Liverpool. In August 1962, shortly after having failed her art teacher's diploma exam, Powell learned that she was pregnant by Lennon. She later explained that she and Lennon had never used contraception, had never talked about it, and did not think about it at the time. When she told Lennon, he said, quote, "There's only one thing for it, Cyn. We'll have to get married." Powell and Lennon were married on the 23rd of August, 1962, at the Mount Pleasant Register office in Liverpool. Fellow Beatles, McCartney and George Harrison, were in attendance, as was their manager, Brian Epstein, who was the best man. No parents were there. The wedding was unromantic because as soon as the ceremony began, a construction site filled the ceremony with noise. When the registrar asked the groom to step forward, Harrison stepped forward. There were no photographs or flowers either. The wedding party was held later, at Epstein's invitation, at Reese's restaurant in Clayton Square, which was where Lennon's parents had held their wedding in 1938. They did not honeymoon until a few weeks later, and were accompanied by Brian Epstein.
And I think we had a situation where I just lost my father when I was 17. He lost his mother through a tragic car accident when he was 17. And I think that, even though we didn't talk about it and I didn't know about it at the time, I think that must have drawn us together because we had an empathy about tragedy.
Wasn't I a good boy? Hey? What's this? What's this then? What's all the noise about? Hey? Come on. There we go. Oh, speak was hold on. Can't have that. You can't have that. Where's your daddy gone? Where's your daddy gone?
In April 1963, their son Julian was born. Lennon was not present, and when he finally arrived at the hospital 3 days later, he said, quote, "He's bloody marvelous, Cyn. Who's going to be a famous rocker like his dad then?" After that, Lennon left the hospital, explaining that he was going on a 4-day vacation to Barcelona with Epstein.
When they became famous, it was like being in the eye of the storm, truly. I mean, we moved to this mansion, and I had great responsibilities with gardeners, with housekeepers, with all the things that I'd never, at the age of 23, never ever experienced before. I had no idea. So really my task and what was happening to me was looking after Julian primarily, most important thing, and then running, TCB, taking care of business, answering all the fan mail, doing all that sort of thing. So my time was taken up with a great deal. But also it was fantastic because they were worldwide success. It was so exciting. It was wonderful. And when he came home, it was the best. When he was away, it was good because you knew that he was happy and he was making a lot of money. And as long as he was happy, that was all that mattered, to be perfectly honest.
That one of the Beatles was married and had a child was not publicly known at the time. But after the christening and the harassment of the media, they were able to realize that a member of the Beatles was a father. On the Beatles' first tour, Lennon allowed the press to photograph them together, which infuriated Epstein. On the tour, he received harassment from fans and decided not to tour the band again. Even in 1967, the Beatles' wives still faced occasional physical danger from Beatles fans, and Cynthia was kicked in the legs by someone who demanded, quote, "Leave John alone." While Lennon was on tour recording, he spent time at home in Kenwood. At some periods, she spent more time with Pattie Boyd and Maureen Starkey than with her own husband. Although she was always oblivious to her husband's drug use, she experienced LSD with John, George, and Pattie without their knowledge. Although she hated the psychological effects of the drugs, she could see the change taking place in her husband. It was like living with someone who had just discovered religion. Tensions, bigotry, and bad temper were replaced by understanding and love. In the decades that followed, Cynthia would always maintain that John's drug use was the beginning of the end for the couple.
So life was good. So he didn't have that angst then, but that was always there. As soon as he stopped, when they were on the road, it was great. When they were successful, it was great. It was when they stopped, that's when it all came back to him, that pain and that anguish.
The Beatles were scheduled to fly to India to visit the Maharishi for 2 or 3 months of transcendental meditation. Before they left, Cynthia found letters from Yoko Ono to Lennon, which indicated he had been having contact with her over a period of time. Lennon denied he was involved with Ono, explaining that she was just some, quote, crazy artist who wanted to be sponsored, although Ono kept up a stream of telephone calls and visits to Kenwood. After 2 weeks, Lennon asked to sleep in a separate room, saying he could only meditate when he was alone. Every morning, Lennon walked to the local post office to see if he had received a telegram from Ono, who sent one almost daily. Cynthia learned of these secret trips much later and said, quote, I had thought our magical interlude with the Maharishi would be the making of our marriage, but in reality, it just presaged the end.
I think we both changed. It was natural that we both changed. But I did not want to go down the road that John was going.
Which road?
Which was the road of enlightenment as far as drugs were concerned. John was in a more trapped situation than I was.
Trapped?
Trapped in his own mind and in the Beatles situation and the pressure of the music and the pop world. And I think he'd had enough, so he wanted to escape that. I had nothing to escape.
During the flight back to England, Lennon got very drunk on scotch and confessed that he had been involved with other women during their marriage. He went on to detail his liaisons with groupies, friends, such as Joan Baez, actress Eleanor Braun, journalist Cleve, and, quote, thousands of women around the globe. 2 weeks later, in May 1968, Lennon suggested Cynthia take a holiday in Greece with Martis, Donovan, and 2 friends, as he would be very busy recording songs for what would become the White Album. She arrived back at Kenwood from Greece earlier than expected at 4 o'clock on May 22, 1968, to discover Lennon and Ono sitting cross-legged on the floor in matching white robes, staring into each other's eyes, and then found Ono's slippers outside the Lennon's bedroom door. As Lennon had initiated divorce proceedings, it prompted her to exclaim, quote, suing me for divorce? On what grounds is he suing me? When the news of Ono's pregnancy broke, Cynthia started her own divorce proceedings against Lennon on the 22nd of August, 1968. She had a couple of meetings with John, and Yoko by his side of course, to clarify maintenance issues and a change between departments. Paul McCartney visited her in Julian that year. On the way to Kenwood, he composed a song in his head that later became Hey Jude. Cynthia recalled, quote, I was truly surprised when, one afternoon, Paul arrived on his own. I was touched by his obvious concern for our welfare. On the journey down, he composed Hey Jude in the car. I will never forget Paul's gesture of care and concern in coming to see us.
It was a matter of taking a lot of time to draw the real John out. I don't think I ever did, obviously, but I did try.
You sent him letters, you sent him flowers, and finally you even put yourself into the limousine in between him and Cynthia.
Well, that's not how it happened.
Yoko Ono was born in Tokyo City on February 18, 1933. In her childhood, she spent time between the United States and Japan, and in 1951 she studied philosophy. She also studied singing and poetry. Over the years, Ono dropped out of college and moved to New York in 1957, working as a secretary and giving lessons in traditional arts at the Japanese Society in Manhattan. Yoko became involved with the Fluxus Group, a cultural association inspired by the Dadaist avant-garde, where they promoted her work and offered Ono her first solo exhibition at the AG Gallery in New York in 1961. In that same period, she had her first marriage and became a mother for the first time. In the early years of the marriage, Ono left most of the responsibility as Kyoko's father to her husband Cox, while she devoted herself to her art full-time. Soon after, the marriage failed. Ono's first contact with any member of the Beatles occurred when she visited Paul McCartney at his home in London to obtain a Lennon-McCartney song manuscript for a book John Cage was working on, Notations. McCartney declined to give her any of his manuscripts, but suggested that Lennon might oblige. Lennon later gave Ono the original handwritten lyrics to The Word. It is curious that when Yoko started looking for the band, Paul was the first target, as he was well known in British avant-garde circles. Ono and Lennon met for the first time on November 7, 1966, at the Indica Gallery in London. John Dunbar, one of its owners, had seen Ono's cut-piece performances in September and invited her to do an exhibition for his gallery. There, They had their first interaction in a piece with the ladder that led to a magnifying glass, and on the back of it, the word yes was above the ceiling. Yoko pretended, even at the first contact with McCartney, not to know the Beatles, and after that day, Lennon became very intrigued by her work. She became more and more involved in John's life, to the point where he was completely in love with her. His divorce from Cynthia was imminent. During the Beatles' breakup, Yoko played a major role in John's life, changing his views on life and music. A few weeks after Lennon and Cynthia's divorce was granted, in 1968, Ono became pregnant but had a miscarriage of a son. The Beatles were Lennon's least interesting subject between 1968 and 1969. He began playing with the Rolling Stones, protests against the Vietnam War, avant-garde collaborations, experimental albums, and a wedding. On March 20th, 1969, Lennon and Ono were married at the registry office in Gibraltar and spent their honeymoon in Amsterdam campaigning with a week-long bed-in for peace. The couple settled in Tittenhurst Park in Berkshire in the south of England. Soon after, John resigned from the Beatles, and within months, the band officially split up. Now, without the band obstructing them, John and Yoko would have a freer path and created the Plastic Ono Band. During the 70s, their marriage would have some ups and downs, from Lennon's problems with deportation to Ono's separation from her daughter. Officially, the couple separated in July 1973, with Ono pursuing her career and Lennon living between Los Angeles and New York with his assistant May Pang on the famous Lost Weekend.
I came to work one morning and Yoko walked into my office at the Dakota and said, "John and I are not getting along. And I know he's going to start seeing other people. And I think I want you to go out with him because I know he needs someone nice like you."
And it just sort of snapped me back into reality. And I said, "Excuse me?"
I want you to understand, I didn't start this. And she said, no, I know that. We'd been having problems.
And you were a 22-year-old secretary at the time, right?
Right. I've been working for them about two and a half years at that point.
How'd you feel when she asked you to have an affair with her?
I was stunned. I didn't know what to expect. I said, "Are you kidding? I can't do that. He's my employer. He's my boss." I said, "He's your husband." And she said, no, it's okay. You should go and do it.
"I want you to go out with him. I know you'll be nice. I know he likes you. You'll go out with him." I said, "No." And she said, "Yes, you will." And she got up and walked out of the room.
Ono had given her approval to the relationship between Lennon and Pang, who, for 18 months, had a loving relationship. Adventures with Harry Nilsson, Keith Moon, Ringo Starr, and even a reunion with Paul McCartney were part of this period, besides being a great moment for John musically. Lennon was thus referring to the name of a film from the 1940s, starring Ray Milland and directed by Billy Wilder. The Lost Weekend chronicled the days of a talented writer mired in alcoholism and his unstoppable downfall. In December 1974, Lennon and Pang considered buying the house together and stopped answering Yoko's calls. The following month, Lennon agreed to meet Ono, who claimed to have found a cure for smoking. After the meeting, Lennon did not return home or call Pang. When he phoned the next day, Ono told him that Lennon was unavailable because he was exhausted after a hypnotherapy session. 2 days later, Lennon appeared at a joint dental appointment with Pang. He was stunned and confused to such an extent that Pang believed he had been brainwashed. He told him that his separation from Ono was over and that it was time to go back. Together again, Lennon and Ono put a pause on their music career and devoted themselves to caring for their son Sean, born on October 9th of 1975. Lennon took on the role of house husband, beginning what would be a 5-year retirement from the music industry, during which he devoted his full attention to his family. 5 years later, Lennon returned to public life, and together with Yoko released Double Fantasy on November 17, 1980. After John's death, Yoko would take over the management of his work, and she continues to do so to this day. Currently, his son Sean is now the main person in charge of the work related to his father, and after 50 years, at over 90 years of age, Yoko Ono moved out of her apartment in the Dakota building to live in a farmhouse bought by John. After John's death, she never remarried.
I've never, ever regretted meeting John because I didn't think about meeting John at the time. I was an art student, he was an art student, and I fell madly in love with this particular person in life. And as far as regrets are concerned now, I have no regrets now because that particular meeting with John took me through so many fantastic years. I have no regrets about meeting John.
Cynthia Powell remarried twice more in the 70s to Italian hotelier Roberto Bassanini, and in the 80s she had another marriage to Lancashire television engineer John Twist. She died on April 1st, 2015, at her home in Palmanova, Mallorca, at the age of 75, after a brief battle with lung cancer, with her son Julian by her side.
There was love in him. He had love for everything. It was almost hurting him that he had so much love. He loved all the places that he went to. He would want to buy a house in every place that we'd been. And he loved all the cities. He loved all the countries. He loved rooms, clothes, people, everything. He loved.
It's all love. Whichever way you look at it, it's all love. How much you can get from each other, and that's determined by how much you're giving to each other. But it all starts within ourselves, and then it spreads to those around us, good and bad. But basically that's it. I think it's the love that we can generate is equal to the love that we get back.
George had several romances during his teenage years. Ruth Morrison, Iris Caldwell, Pauline Bien, Monica Prickin, and Anne-Marie Guerin. And in the rise of his fame, he was briefly involved with Bernadette Farrell and Estelle Bennett. But it was not until 1964, while the Beatles were recording A Hard Day's Night, that George met Pattie Boyd.
I'm sorry, miss. You mustn't fraternize with meat prisoners.
Prisoners?
You are. Get out, ladies! Get out while you can!
Boyd's camera skills were honed through years spent on the other side of the lens. She was working as a shampoo girl in a London beauty salon in 1962 when an agent approached her about a modeling job. Before long, she was posing for legendary photographers like David Bailey and Terrence Donovan while decked out in the latest hot couture designs by Ozzie Clark or Mary Quant, famed mother of the miniskirt. For Boyd, the innovative styles were early signs of the budding youth movement that would blossom as the decade progressed. Fashion really seemed indicative of a bigger change in how people were thinking, she says. When I first started modeling, everybody was still a little old-fashioned and dressing like their mothers. And then gradually, I noticed skirts were getting shorter. It all started changing rapidly after that.
I started working when I was about 17, 18 as a fashion model. When I was modelling, I realised that I was actually quite interested in what was going on behind the camera, what the photographer was seeing. And so I saved up my money and bought a Pentax, my first camera. When I would go for modelling jobs, I'd take my camera with me and get a little bit of advice. I'd worked for lots of magazines and papers, and then I started doing TV commercials. Then one day, my agent phoned and said that I got a part in the Beatles film, but it was very secret, and I wasn't to tell anyone. So it was really exciting. The Beatles were incredibly polite and charming. George was very sweet, and I thought he was quite shy, like me. I think that's why we got on initially. When I first met George Harrison, I thought he was very handsome, and I thought he had the most beautiful velvet brown eyes. We sat next to each other for lunch on the train to London, and George said, would I come out with him tonight? And I said, no, so sorry, I can't. I'm seeing my boyfriend. And his face dropped. My girlfriends were horrified that I would say no to a date with George Harrison. And so boyfriend had to go. And then a week later, the director wanted us to return to one of the film studios for one press shot. So we at the back doing their hair. Then George said to me, how's the boyfriend? I said, I don't have one. And he said, good, let's go out tonight. And this started our relationship.
The couple married less than 2 years later on January 21st, 1966, with Paul McCartney as George's best man.
George was so adorable when he was away on tour because he missed me and I missed him dreadfully. And he would write amazing letters from different hotels and wonderful postcards. There was huge attention from the fans and from the press. And so there'd always be girls at the front door and following us around. And then Brian Epstein suggested that we all buy a house in the country.
They settled into a modest house in the staid London suburb of Esher, where they quickly began to liven up the drab gray exterior with hand-painted, psychedelic day-glow swirls. It was the most boring bungalow you can imagine. So dreadful. We had to do something to it. So, we bought a bunch of cans of paint and spray paint and painted it. Whoever came helped us paint the outside of the whole place. There were a lot of people smoking pot and drinking wine. It was a really fabulous and happy place. Toward the end of the 1960s, the Beatles' energies became less focused on the band and more on their families and individual interests. And it was Boyd who recommended lessons in transcendental meditation from Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, a world-renowned guru. Problems in the studio inevitably seeped into the Harrisons' private lives. Quote, George would get so angry, but he tended to bottle it up, Boyd says. So he would be angry at home about anything at all. I would say, what is the matter? And he would start shouting about the band and various members and how everything was dreadful and ghastly. He wasn't specific about it, but I knew there was something serious going on that was very troubling for him.
But then the anger came from the frustration that he had. When you glimpse something that you understand, but you can't be there because there's something earthly holding you back. And he was very aware of that.
What were the earthly things that pulled on him the most?
The other three Beatles. And what they were creating and were continuing to create, this huge empire, Apple. I think he felt that he'd found something that he totally understood and wanted to just be there, be in it. He became totally absorbed with meditation.
The couple continued to drift as the 1970s progressed. Harrison's growing devotion to Eastern spirituality made him increasingly distant, and his enthusiastic cocaine use left him emotionally racked. Most painful for Boyd was that his infidelities were becoming more frequent and less discreet. After an affair with Maureen Starkey, Ringo Starr's wife, the marriage was all but over.
I think the photograph that I've taken that I am more pleased with is a photograph of George and I when we were in Isha. And we'd been playing around in the swimming pool. Anyway, I set up my tripod, put the camera on it and said, George, just come and stand here near these roses. And so I set it up, put it on the timer, and we're both standing there looking and looking and looking. And it took so long for it to click that George by now is obviously thinking of a song, I like to think. And he looks away. And then the camera clicked. And there's George just looking away. In a beautiful, soft way. I love that.
The marriage came to an end in 1974, officially divorcing on June 9th of 1977. Despite this, they continued to maintain a friendly relationship.
And I had become, bit by bit, more and more obsessed with his wife, Pattie.
From time to time during the spring and summer of 1970, Eric and I saw each other. One day, we were walking down Oxford Street when Eric said, "Do you like me then, or are you seeing me because I'm famous?" I replied, "Oh, I thought you were seeing me because I'm famous." And we both laughed. He always found it difficult to talk about his feelings. Instead, he poured them into his music and writing. Another of our secret meetings took place at a flat in South Kensington in London. Eric wanted me to listen to a song he'd written. He switched on the tape machine, turned up the volume, and played me the most powerful, moving song I'd ever heard. It was Layla, about a man who falls hopelessly in love with a woman who loves him but is unavailable. My first thought was, oh God, everyone's going to know who this is. I felt uncomfortable that he was pushing me in a direction I wasn't certain I wanted to go. But the song got the better of me with the realization that I had inspired such passion and such creativity. I could no longer resist. That evening, I went to a party at the rock manager Robert Stigwood's house in Stanmore, North London. George had said he didn't want to go. Eric was there, and I felt elated by what had happened earlier in the day, but also felt deeply guilty. Much later in the evening, George appeared. He kept asking, "Where's Pattie?" He was about to leave when he spotted me in the garden with Eric. He came over to us and said, "What's going on?" Eric said, "I have to tell you, man, that I'm in love with your wife." George was furious. He turned to me and said, "Well, are you going with him or coming with me?"
And said, "Look, I think this is going to happen, and I think, it is already, there's the feelings there, and I have to know what you feel about that." Or, I mean, if it was almost like, well, if you want me to stop or go away, I will, but I need to know what. And he was very kind of cavalier. He said, well, take her, she's yours, kind of thing. But in fact, can I have that? We'll swap, I mean, but and to be honest, it had kind of almost got to that before anyway. There was a lot of kind of swapping going on, a lot of fooling around, and this is 60s free love stuff. I mean, so and George's attitude seemed to have more wisdom in it than anyone else's, in that this is all material, it's all Maya, it's all irrelevant to the bigger picture. It doesn't really matter, in other words. And I thought, God, well, that's almost like giving me carte blanche.
I thought he was really somebody who was saying something that I connected with. He was really a very captivating person, and he was working. And I liked the music, I liked what he was doing. We just seemed like partners from the very beginning.
Born in Los Angeles, but with Mexican origins, Olivia attended Hawthorne High School and graduated in 1963. She later worked in marketing at A&M Records, where George Harrison later had a recording contract with his Dark Horse Records label. She met George in his most difficult personal and artistic period. Depressed and immersed in a world of drugs, George and she met on the phone in 1974. They had a lot in common. She practiced meditation and read Indian philosophy, besides being a vegetarian since before meeting George. She accompanied Harrison on his Dark Horse tour, and George said on several occasions that Olivia saved him, as she helped him fight his addictions and put his life in order.
He was really a free person, and he did not like to be bound by rules. But he did like women, and women did like him, and he was, if he just said a couple words to a woman, honestly, he had a profound effect on people. So that was always something that was, and I'm not the only one who's had to deal with this, person who's well-loved. So that was always a challenge.
Harrison's infidelities persisted. The relationship lasted more than 25 years, and Harrison's only son, Denis, was born from it. Because of the personality of both, it was probably the most discreet marriage of all the sentimental relationships of the members of the Beatles.
Yeah, we had our differences. I might have done a different technique than he did, but we both had the same goal. And I think that was really the key to everything in our lives.
Because I don't go discothequing and things like that where people hang out with their cameras, so they presumed that I was Howard Hughes with my big fingernails and Kleenex tissues and that kind of stuff. Bottles of urine all around the house. But I wasn't like that at all. I go out all the time, or a lot of the time, see friends, have dinner, go to parties.
Sounds all right.
I'm even more normal than, normal people.
Hello? How are you?
Mary Cox, who would later change her name to Maureen, was born on August 4th, 1946 in Liverpool. She left the nuns' school at the age of 14 and began her career as an apprentice manicurist/hairdresser. Her friends knew her as Mo. At 15, Cox became a regular visitor to the Cavern Club, experiencing the long lines and fierce competition for access to the now popular Beatles shows. Although Ringo, whom she called Richie, kissed her once, he didn't immediately notice her among his many fans. He was 6 years older than she was. Months later, they began dating formally in 1962. As it happened to Cynthia, and as it happened to Pattie, she too was often threatened by fans, and once scratched in the face by a fierce fan. She even had to quit working as a hairdresser because of the threats. After discovering she was pregnant, in late January 1965, 18-year-old Maureen married Starr at Caxton Hall Registry Office on February 11th, 1965.
Are you really going to get a honeymoon?
No, I don't think so. Not with the likes of you chaps around.
Do you expect your marriage?
John and George were at the wedding and they were made up,
Presumably met Ringo before the group were very successful, did you?
Yes.
Did you expect he was going to become a public monument like this?
Well, in Liverpool I did.
Yeah.
I didn't think sort of more or less all over the world,
Ringo was less likely to cheat on Mo, and did so much less frequently, but he did. There was some sort of pact that as long as Ringo confessed his transgressions, she was willing to forgive him. They also described the marriage as very quiet and envied by the other Beatles and their associates. However, Starr would later admit that he had been, quote, a wife-beating drunk and an absentee father. They divorced on July 17, 1975. Around this time, Maureen was cheating on him with his best friend George Harrison. In fact, George's wife, Pattie Boyd, was the one who told Ringo about the affair. After the divorce, Maureen became so depressed that she attempted suicide by crashing a motorcycle into a brick wall. Sometime later, Maureen began living with Isaac Tigrett in 1976. He was one of the founders of the Hard Rock Cafe and the House of Blues. They had a daughter together, Augusta King, in 1987, and the couple married in 1989. Maureen died at age 48 on December 30th, 1994 of leukemia. Her 82-year-old mother, her 4 children, her husband, and Ringo were by her side when she passed away.
Are you happy?
The second half of the 70s gave Ringo a second win as a rock star, in which excesses would be the order of the day. His musical career was on a downward spiral, and acting-wise, he wasn't doing great roles either. But perhaps one of his most unthinkable roles led him to cross paths with the love of his life.
You met on the movie set, but apparently really didn't get chummy until the movie was almost over.
Yes, she played hard to get for 3 months.
Is that so?
No, that's not so.
Over to you, Bob.
Yes, dear. Actually, we were lucky because we became good friends first. I mean, we got the film together, we met in L.A. at the director's house for an evening, and then on set, we rehearsed together, we started working together, and I started realizing, hey, he's a nice guy. He's really sweet, even if he is a Beatle.
Yeah.
And
well, that's an important point. He brings that great institution.
Off, you know, and he's just a regular guy, and I'm in love with him.
Barbara Bach, born in New York in 1947, was already a well-known model and actress when she met Ringo. Her role in the James Bond movie, The Spy Who Loved Me, brought her to international fame and also made her a sex symbol. It was in 1980 when the film The Caveman brought them together. They fell in love instantly. Ringo always said that his relationship with Barbara was a true love affair. On April 27, 1981, they got married. But the 80s were not so successful for the couple in professional terms. Ringo was still a bit stagnant musically, and Barbara gave up acting and modeling in the middle of the decade. Together, they struggled with addictions, and in 1988, completely overwhelmed, they checked into a rehab center in Arizona. Immediately after leaving treatment in 1989, they formed their first all-star band, a supergroup led by Starr that continues to tour the country. Starr says the fact that he formed a band after quitting drinking is no coincidence. There's an absolute connection, he said. When I stopped drinking, I had all this time and more energy. Fortunately, the couple has lived a full and clean life ever since. Had it not been for their decision to trade drugs for meditation and for having each other's emotional support, neither would be here today. Speaking about the key to their relationship in 2015, Ringo concluded, "There's no escaping it. I think I love Barbara as much today as when we met, and I'm beyond blessed that she loves me, and that we're still together." Paul McCartney probably has the longest history of women in a Beatles' life. In addition to his hundreds of affairs, he was engaged to Dot Rohn, Jane Asher, and married to Linda Eastman, Heather Mills, and Nancy Chevelle. McCartney had a 3-year relationship with Dot Rohn in Liverpool. She was his first girlfriend. She was one of the fans who went to the Casbah Club when the Beatles were still the Quarrymen. She became pregnant, they were going to get married. Paul bought her a gold ring in Hamburg, but she lost the child and the wedding was cancelled. Upon their return to England, the relationship seemed to fall apart and ended in the summer of 1962. A few months later, the Beatles achieved national fame.
I give her all my love, that's all I do.
Jane Asher was born in London on April 5, 1946. Jane gained early fame as a child actress. On April 18, 1963, 17-year-old Jane Asher met Paul at the Royal Albert Hall in London before a performance by the Beatles. I met Jane Asher when she was sent by the Radio Times to cover a concert we were in at the Royal Albert Hall. We had a photo taken with her for the magazine, and we all fancied her. We thought she was blonde, because we had only ever seen her on black and white telly doing jukebox jury. But she turned out to be a redhead, so it was, wow, you're a redhead. I tried pulling her, succeeded, and we were boyfriend and girlfriend for quite a long time. After that night, Paul walked her home and they agreed to meet again. They had several dates in London, and their romance became public when they were photographed leaving the Prince of Wales Theatre after seeing Sumner Arthur Long's play, Never Too Late. After that, they became one of the most frequently featured couples in the press. In December of 1963, Paul moved into Asher's family home and remained there until the couple moved to Paul's home in St. John's Wood in 1966. At the Asher home, Paul wrote Yesterday. Jane inspired other songs such as For No One and I Love Her, Things We Said Today, You Won't See Me, I'm Looking Through You, or Here, There, and Everywhere, to mention a few. On December 25th, 1967, they announced their engagement. Their schedules began to complicate the relationship. The Beatles tours and the band's long recording sessions intersected with Asher's acting schedule. In mid-1968, Jane returned to London earlier than expected after working as an actress in Bristol. There, she discovered Paul in bed with Francie Schwartz. She stormed out and left. Soon after, Margaret Asher, her mother, went to Cavendish Avenue to pick up her daughter's things. On July 20th, 1968, Jane Asher was a guest on Simon Dee's BBC television show, Dee Time, and publicly announced that her engagement to Paul McCartney had been called off, an announcement that came as a surprise to Paul himself. I haven't broken it off, but it is broken off, finished. I know it sounds corny, but we still see each other and love each other, but it hasn't worked out. Perhaps we'll be childhood sweethearts and meet again and get married when we're about 70. Jane Asher and I were together for around 5 years, so at the back of my mind I expected to marry her, but as the time got closer, I think I also realized it wasn't right. You can't ever put your finger on it, but when Linda came along, shortly after Jane and I broke up, I just thought, oh, I don't know, maybe this is more right. And then when Linda and I got to know each other, I felt, this is more me, I'm more her. And there were little things with Jane where we just didn't quite match up. I loved a lot of things about her, and I will always admire a lot of things about her. She's a wonderful woman, but little bits of the jigsaw weren't quite fitting.
She married me. This is something you mustn't do, see, with the Beatles. You mustn't marry them, because you come in for a lot of criticism, whoever you are. Even the Duke of Edinburgh would have come in for a lot of flack. It's just, I think it was that, really. People kind of said, oh, well, you know, who does she think she is?
Linda Eastman was born in New York on September 24th of 1941. Linda loved nature and animals and enjoyed riding horses as a child. After graduating from Vermont College, she attended the University of Arizona and majored in fine arts while taking up nature photography as a hobby. She then left the University of Arizona without graduating and married Joseph Melville C. Jr. in June 1962. Their daughter Heather was born in December of that same year. They divorced in 1965. Linda became a receptionist and editorial assistant for Town & Country magazine. In 1965, she became romantically involved with photographer David Dalton, from whom Linda learned a few things to improve her technique. Months later, Eastman was already taking pictures of rock bands. Her look was unique. When the magazine received an invitation to photograph the Rolling Stones during an album promotion party on a yacht, Eastman immediately offered to represent the publication. The photo shoot marked a turning point in her life. I was the only photographer they allowed on the yacht. I just kept clicking away with the camera, and they enjoyed it, and I enjoyed it. And suddenly I found that taking pictures was a great way to live and a great way to work. A few months after a photo shoot for the Rolling Stones, she was allowed backstage at Shea Stadium, where the Beatles performed. Eastman had gained some experience in celebrity photography and became the unofficial photographer for Bill Graham's Fillmore East Concert Hall. Among the artists she photographed there were Todd Rundgren, Aretha Franklin, Jimi Hendrix, Bob Dylan, Janis Joplin, Simon & Garfunkel, The Who, The Doors, The Animals, and Neil Young. She photographed Eric Clapton for Rolling Stone magazine and became the first woman to have a photograph on the cover. On May 15th, 1967, Eastman met Paul McCartney at the Bag o' Nails Club.
I was in London on a photographic assignment down at a club. I went to see Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames, who's a British group, and Paul was down there. Were you not?
And I picked her up.
You picked me up just like that.
Simple as that, Tom.
Very romantic.
I love you coming down to speak, you know. Yeah.
They met again 4 days later at the Sgt. Pepper's release party at Brian Epstein's house. They met again in May the following year in New York, while McCartney and John Lennon were there to launch Apple Records. Months later, McCartney invited Eastman to spend some time with him in London. She arrived and they went to his house where they spent the evening. McCartney was attracted to Eastman for a number of reasons, which he explained later. I liked her as a woman. She was good looking with a good figure, so physically I was attracted to her. McCartney also liked her sense of independence. Her mental attitude was quite rebellious. Growing up, she was the kind of kid who would hang out in the kitchen with the black maids to learn cooking. She disliked socializing. They both liked natural surroundings, he said, and they shared a love of nature, which became one of their most important emotional links. He knew that because of her very free spirit, she was considered a rebel and a black sheep by her family for avoiding excelling in education, unlike her father and brother. She was an artist, Paul said, and was not cut out to be an academic. Linda's daughter Heather created another strong bond between them, as Paul had always liked the idea of having children. When McCartney met Heather, who was almost 6 years old, he insisted that she and Linda move to London to live with him. After they did, he spent time with Heather playing with her, reading her stories, and drawing her cartoons. He would sing her to sleep before bedtime. They were married 6 months later in a small civil ceremony. She was already 4 months pregnant with their daughter Mary at Marylebone Registry Office on March 12, 1969. After the break of the Beatles, Linda helped Paul to overcome the depression and move forward together. With her, he formed Wings. Her activity during the 70s was marked by the success of Wings and supporting a growing family. In the 80s, marked by the murder of John Lennon, Paul stopped touring and Wings ceased to exist.
I don't think you'll have a long relationship where people just get a bit fed up or they think, oh, I don't agree with that, and you start arguing about it, but I would never change it. I don't think of him as a living legend. I really think of him as my husband, as a man, you know. I treat him like any man.
When you've been married 20 years like me, it's not a sweet subject at all. It's bittersweet, it's both.
Although Linda was always by his side, but little by little, she resumed her career as a photographer and encouraged Paul to become an animal activist. They both became vegetarians. McCartney has said that he and Linda spent less than a week apart during their entire marriage, which lasted almost 30 years, excluding McCartney's imprisonment in Tokyo in January 1980.
She's a great woman, very strong woman, very misunderstood, because when she does interviews, tends to tense up, because she's not really a sort of professional person that way. She's not used to being in the public eye. She's used to being behind the camera, which is a lot easier than actually sitting there and explaining, trying to justify living. I'm okay, honest, you know. So whenever she gets in front of a camera, she does tend to be very serious and talk about issues that concern her deeply, which a lot of people like, but some people, I think, take it as a hardness and a sort of coldness, which is the very opposite of how she is, actually. She's a great cook, great mother. She's a good girl.
In the 1990s, they resumed touring and stayed together. The marriage went through some difficult times during that period, but Linda's illness changed things forever. Linda was diagnosed with breast cancer in 1995. Paul knew the prognosis and later said, "The doctors had told me privately that we had caught it too late, that she had about 18 months to live."
We had our ups and downs, I don't want it to seem like, rosy. I mean, we argued and we argue, because you've got to have that. You can't just, male, female, very difficult to live together,
Right.
It's difficult, as we all know, it's just like not easy. But we've always had a good sense of humor. We've always been quite honest with each other, and we've been lucky. We spent a lot of time together.
You've had a tough couple of years with her health. Much talked about that she's been battling breast cancer. How's she doing, first of all?
She's doing great.
She died of the disease at age 56 on April 17, 1998. Her family was with her when she died.
Getting married is quite a weird situation, I think, because suddenly for the first time in your life you're living very, very intimately with someone who you don't necessarily know.
Probably still mourning the loss of Linda, Paul dated a couple of women between the late 1990s and early 2000s, the year he met Heather Mills. Mills rose to fame when she was a model in 1993 and was involved in a collision with a police motorcycle in London. The accident resulted in the amputation of her left leg below the knee, but she continued modeling using a prosthesis. Unlike almost all the Beatles couples, Heather grew up in a complicated environment. Her sister Fiona recalled her childhood this way. "Our family was always short of money, and our father demanded we find food and clothes, so we resorted to shoplifting, learned to hide from bailiffs, and became experts at housework. I'm not ashamed to say that we were forced to steal because when you're a little girl, you'd rather do it than face a beating from your father. Her adolescence was turbulent, and she had accusations of theft in some of her jobs. Her life changed a bit when she started modeling. She had a failed marriage that lasted 2 years, and at the same time she started doing activism. She worked on the front line in a war zone in the former Yugoslavia for 2 years, where there were mines everywhere that were not marked. On August 8, 1993, Mills was struck by a police motorcycle responding to an emergency call. Mills suffered crushed ribs, a punctured lung, and the loss of her left leg. The police compensated her with £200,000, and she sold her story to the media for a similar amount, with which she founded the Heather Mills Health Trust, which existed between 2000 and 2004, which provided prosthetic limbs to people who had lost limbs after stepping on landmines. Mills met McCartney at the Dorchester Hotel during the Pride of Britain Awards ceremony in April 1999. At the event, McCartney spoke to Mills about donating to his charity, and later gave him £150,000. After attracting media interest for his appearances at events with Heather Mills, McCartney appeared publicly with her at a party in January 2000 to celebrate her 32nd birthday. He was 57.
McCartney in love.
I was very impressed, with her speaking, as a lot of people have said already. So I found out a telephone number, like you do.
Yeah.
And rang her up and said, we should talk about some charity stuff. I like what you're doing.
And while on vacation in the Lake District, McCartney proposed to Mills on July 23, 2001.
It is tomorrow.
But it's a secret.
But it's a secret. Now, if you didn't get that, you didn't get it.
Mills and McCartney married on June 11, 2002, 4 years after McCartney's first wife died of breast cancer. The wedding between McCartney and Mills was an elaborate ceremony at Castle Leslie in the village of Glasslough in County Monaghan, Ireland. A song specially composed by McCartney, called Heather, which had been included on the 2001 album Driving Rain, was performed. Mills' ectopic pregnancies had damaged her fertility, and her chances of becoming pregnant were small, but the couple announced in May 2003 that they were expecting their first child. Mills gave birth to Beatrice Millie McCartney on October 28 of 2003. The couple were seen a lot publicly, and Paul was spotted in unusual places for his reputation, such as when he appeared on ITV's Who Wants to Be a Millionaire.
We'll go with Atlanta final answer.
Yeah.
It's the right answer!
But nothing lasts forever, and this marriage would end in one of the most controversial and talked about divorces of the century. Hateful statements from both parties were the order of the day in a trial that lasted for years. Both damaged their public image with statements of all kinds. At the beginning of the trial, Mills asked for £125 million, but McCartney offered $15.8 million. The judgment was made public on March 17, 2008. Mills eventually received a lump sum of £16.5 million, along with assets worth £7.8 million, which included the properties he owned at the time. The total was £24.3 million, plus payments of £35,000 a year for a nanny and her daughter's school fees. After her divorce, the British media's attitude toward her was hostile. The negative image of her persists to this day, and she once told the Evening Standard that claims that she had married McCartney for his money were more painful than losing her leg.
You got to accentuate the positive.
After the traumatic divorce, Paul dated a couple of other public figures between 2006 and 2007, and in November of that year, he began dating Nancy Chevelle. Contrasted with his ex-wife's origins, Nancy was a board member of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, as well as vice president of a transportation conglomerate. On May 6, 2011, it was announced that the two had become engaged, and October 9, 2011, McCartney and Chevelle were married at Marylebone Town Hall, where their first wedding took place in 1969. McCartney wrote the song My Valentine from his 2012 album Kisses on the Bottom for her, and they remain married to this day. Well, that's all for now. We hope this video has been to your liking, and we ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching. This is Music Box.